Every night for 3 months, the residents of Lantern Ridge watched in terror as mysterious lights flickered across the mountainside in deliberate patterns. What they discovered would reveal a conspiracy of revenge that had been brewing in the shadows for years, orchestrated by families whose loved ones had died in what were believed to be mining accidents. But the truth behind those lights would prove that some accidents were never accidents at all. But before we descend into the dark tunnels of this mystery, I need you to do something for me. If you're drawn to stories that uncover hidden truths, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Also, I'm curious, from which city and country are you listening to this story? Let me know in the comments below. Your support keeps these mysteries alive. Now, let's uncover what really happened in those West Virginia mountains, where the line between justice and vengeance became as blurred as those flickering lights in the darkness. According to local records and testimonies passed down through generations, the events we're about to explore began during one of the harshest winters in Appalachian memory, when the silence of snow-covered peaks was broken by signals that would expose decades of carefully hidden crimes. In the winter of 1888, Lantern Ridge stood as one of West Virginia's most productive coal mining settlements, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, about 40 miles southeast of Charleston. The town consisted of roughly 800 souls, most of whom lived in company-owned houses that lined the narrow valley like wooden soldiers standing guard over the mouth of the Blackstone mine. The settlement had grown rapidly over the previous decade, attracting families from across the region with promises of steady work and fair wages. The reality, however, was far more complex. The Blackstone Mining Company, owned by industrialist Harrison Blackstone and his partners from Pittsburgh, operated under the philosophy that miners were as replaceable as the coal they extracted. Robert Lantern had arrived in Lantern Ridge 6 months earlier, hired as the mine's chief engineer after completing his studies at the Virginia Military Institute. At 28 years old, he possessed both the technical knowledge to improve mining operations and the idealism to believe he could make conditions safer for the workers. His appointment had been met with skepticism by the longtime residents who had learned through bitter experience that company men rarely had their best interests at heart. The town itself reflected the harsh realities of mountain life. Narrow wooden houses lined muddy streets that turned treacherous with each rainfall. The company store dominated the center of town, where miners were required to purchase goods with company scrip rather than real currency, ensuring they remained perpetually indebted to their employer. The only church, a modest Presbyterian structure built with donated labor, served as the community's gathering place for both worship and the frequent funerals that marked the dangerous nature of their work. Robert had initially focused his efforts on modernizing the mine's ventilation systems and improving structural supports in the deeper tunnels. He worked closely with shift supervisors like Marcus Webb, a gruff man in his 50s who had been with the company for over 15 years, and Thomas Caldwell, whose family had been among the first settlers in the region. Both men had initially welcomed Robert's safety improvements, though he noticed they often exchanged meaningful glances when certain topics arose. The miners themselves were a tight-knit community, bound together by shared hardships and mutual dependence. Families like the O'Briens, McGraths, and Hendersons had worked these tunnels for generations, passing down not only their trade, but also their suspicions about the company's true priorities. Robert had observed that conversations often stopped when he approached, and certain names seemed to carry weight that he didn't understand. On the night of December 15, 1888, Robert first witnessed the phenomenon that would consume his thoughts for months to come. He had been working late in his office, reviewing blueprints for a new support structure in the eastern tunnel, when movement outside his window caught his attention. High on the opposite mountainside, a light appeared and disappeared in rapid succession. At first, Robert assumed it was simply someone carrying a lantern along one of the mountain paths. But as he continued to watch, the pattern became unmistakable. 3 quick flashes, followed by a pause, then 2 longer flashes, another pause, and finally a series of rapid blinks that lasted nearly 30 seconds. The display repeated itself exactly 3 times before the mountain returned to darkness. Robert made note of the time, 11:47 p.m., and the weather conditions. The sky was clear, with a nearly full moon providing excellent visibility across the valley. The temperature had dropped below freezing, making it unlikely that anyone would venture out without urgent purpose. The next morning, Robert mentioned the lights to Marcus Webb during their routine inspection of the morning shift. Webb's reaction was immediate and telling. The older man's face hardened, and he glanced around nervously before speaking. "Best not to pay attention to such things, Mr. Lantern," Webb said, his voice carrying a warning tone that Robert had never heard before. "Mountain folk have their own ways, and company men who ask too many questions sometimes find themselves reassigned to other locations." Thomas Caldwell, who had been checking equipment nearby, approached them with obvious concern. "You saw them too?" he asked Robert directly. When Robert nodded, Caldwell exchanged a meaningful look with Webb. "How many times did the pattern repeat?" "3 times exactly," Robert replied, "always the same sequence." Both supervisors went pale. Caldwell excused himself abruptly, claiming he needed to check on the Eastern Tunnel crew, while Webb suggested they focus on their inspection duties and forget about the previous night's observations. But Robert's engineering mind couldn't let go of the mathematical precision he had witnessed. The timing of the flashes, their exact repetition, and the specific location on the mountainside all suggested deliberate communication rather than random activity. That evening, Robert positioned himself at his office window at 11:30 p.m., determined to observe the phenomenon more carefully. The lights appeared again at 11:47 p.m. precisely, following the same pattern with mechanical accuracy. This time, however, Robert noticed something he had missed before. Immediately after the light sequence ended, he caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows near the mine entrance below. 2 figures emerged from behind the equipment shed and walked quickly toward the residential area. In the moonlight, Robert could make out their general shapes but not their identities. They moved with purpose and familiarity, suggesting they knew exactly where they were going and why. The implications began to trouble Robert deeply. The precision timing, the repeated patterns, and the coordinated movement below all pointed to organized activity. But what kind of communication required such secrecy, and why did the mention of the lights cause such obvious fear among the supervisors? Over the following weeks, Robert began to pay closer attention to the undercurrents of tension that flowed through Lantern Ridge like an underground river. What he discovered in the company records painted a disturbing picture of the mine's history. During the past 5 years, Blackstone Mine had experienced an unusually high number of fatal accidents. The official reports, filed with the State Mining Commission, attributed these deaths to standard occupational hazards, tunnel collapses, equipment failures, and gas explosions. However, when Robert examined the details more carefully, disturbing patterns emerged. 7 miners had died in separate incidents between 1884 and 1887. Each death had occurred during night shifts when fewer witnesses were present. In every case, the deceased miner had recently filed complaints about unsafe working conditions or had been involved in discussions about organizing for better wages. Most troubling of all, 3 of the deaths had happened to men who had served as informal leaders among the workers. Robert discovered that Patrick O'Brien, who had died in a supposed tunnel collapse in June 1885, had been circulating a petition demanding proper ventilation in the deeper shafts just 2 weeks before his death. Michael McGrath, killed in an equipment failure in September 1886, had been organizing secret meetings to discuss striking for higher wages. James Henderson, who died in a gas explosion in March 1887, had been gathering testimony from other miners about supervisors who ignored safety protocols in favor of increased production quotas. The families of these men had received standard company compensation, enough to cover burial expenses and a small payment to help with immediate needs. However, none had been offered ongoing support, and several families had been forced to leave Lantern Ridge when they could no longer afford company housing. What made these discoveries even more unsettling was the reaction Robert observed when he asked about the deceased miners. Older workers would become suddenly silent, wives would quickly change the subject, and even children seemed to understand that certain names should not be spoken aloud. Robert's investigation led him to Sarah Henderson, the widow of James Henderson, who still lived in town with her 2 young sons. She worked as a seamstress, taking in washing and mending to support her family. When Robert approached her carefully, claiming he was reviewing safety records to prevent future accidents, Sarah's response confirmed his growing suspicions. "Mr. Lanton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as they spoke outside the church after Sunday service. "My James knew that mine better than any man alive. He could smell gas from 50 yards away and could tell you if a support beam was sound just by looking at it. He didn't die because he made a mistake." She glanced around nervously before continuing. 3 days before he died, he told me he had proof that certain supervisors were being paid extra to ignore safety violations in sections where the company wanted to increase output. He said he was going to take that proof to the state inspectors. Sarah's words hung in the cold mountain air like a physical presence. The night he died, James went into that tunnel alone because he received a message that there was an emergency requiring immediate attention. But there was no emergency, Mr. Lanton. Only James in the wrong place at the wrong time, with too much knowledge for his own good. Robert's investigation took on new urgency after his conversation with Sarah Henderson. He began to systematically review every accident report, cross-referencing them with production records, shift schedules, and personnel files. What emerged was a pattern so deliberate and calculated that it could only represent conspiracy. Each of the 7 accidental deaths had occurred within 48 hours of that miner reaching out to someone outside the company, either to family members about potential testimony, to other miners about organizing, or to outside authorities about safety violations. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Furthermore, Robert discovered that Supervisor Thomas Caldwell had been present at the mine during 4 of the 7 fatal incidents, despite those accidents occurring outside his normal shift schedule. Marcus Webb had been on duty during 3 others. Both men had filed reports that consistently supported the company's version of events, describing the deceased miners as careless or prone to taking unnecessary risks. The breakthrough in Robert's investigation came when he decided to monitor the mysterious light signals more systematically. Starting in early January 1889, he maintained a detailed log of each appearance, noting the exact time, weather conditions, and any variations in the pattern. What he discovered was that the lights appeared only on specific nights, always exactly 3 days before the monthly payroll was distributed, and always when certain supervisors were scheduled for night duty. The pattern never varied. 3 quick flashes, 2 longer ones, then an extended series of rapid blinks. But Robert began to notice that the final sequence varied in length, sometimes lasting 20 seconds, other times extending to nearly a minute. On January 18th, Robert made a crucial decision. Instead of watching from his office window, he would position himself on the mountainside to observe the signals from closer range. He waited until after midnight, then quietly made his way up the steep path that led toward the source of the lights. The climb was treacherous in the snow and darkness, but Robert's military training had prepared him for difficult terrain. After nearly an hour of careful movement, he reached a position where he could see both the light source and the mine below. What he witnessed that night changed everything. The lights were coming from a carefully concealed position behind a cluster of large rocks, operated by 2 figures who moved with military precision. They used a shuttered lantern to create their signals, with one person operating the shutter while the other consulted what appeared to be a written code. Most shocking of all, Robert recognized one of the figures as David McGrath, the younger brother of Michael McGrath, who had died in the equipment failure 3 years earlier. But the real revelation came when Robert observed the response to the light signals. Down at the mine, answering flashes came from a window in the supervisor's office. Brief acknowledgments that confirmed the mountain signals had been received and understood. Robert realized he was witnessing a sophisticated communication network that connected the families of the dead miners with someone inside the mine's management structure. The precision and regularity of the signals suggested an organized effort that had been operating for months, possibly years. As he made his way back down the mountain, Robert's mind raced with the implications. If the families of the dead miners were coordinating with someone inside the company, what was their purpose? Were they gathering evidence of the murders they suspected? Were they planning some form of retaliation? Or was something even more complex taking place in the shadows of Lantern Ridge? The answer to Robert's questions came sooner than he expected, and in a form more dramatic than he could have imagined. On February 3rd, 1889, a significant accident was scheduled to occur at Blackstone Mine. Robert knew this because he had been monitoring the light signals carefully and had noticed changes in the pattern during the previous week. The final sequence of rapid blinks had grown longer each night, and on February the 2nd, the signals had been followed by 3 additional long flashes, a new element that suggested urgency or finality. Robert's engineering responsibilities had led him to schedule a routine inspection of the Eastern Tunnel's new support structures for the morning of February 3rd. As he prepared his equipment, he was approached by Thomas Caldwell, who seemed unusually agitated. "Mr. Lantern, I need to ask you to postpone your inspection until tomorrow," Caldwell said, avoiding eye contact. "We've had reports of unusual gas readings in that section, and I want to bring in a specialized crew to check the ventilation before anyone else goes down there." Robert's suspicions immediately flared. The Eastern Tunnel had been thoroughly tested just 2 days earlier, and his own instruments had detected no gas issues. More importantly, if there were legitimate safety concerns, company protocol required immediate evacuation of the area and notification of all personnel, not a quiet postponement of inspections. "I'll be happy to help with the gas testing," Robert replied carefully. "My equipment is more sensitive than the standard meters, and I can get readings from multiple depths simultaneously." Caldwell's reaction confirmed Robert's fears. The supervisor's face flushed with obvious anxiety, and he began making excuses about specialized procedures and company policies that Robert knew didn't exist. "That won't be necessary," Caldwell said firmly. "The company has contracted with outside specialists who will handle the situation. I need you to focus on the surface operations today and leave the tunnel work to others." But Robert had no intention of being sidelined, especially when he suspected that lives might be at stake. Instead of reporting to his surface duties, he made his way to a concealed observation point overlooking the mine entrance and waited to see what would develop. What he witnessed over the next several hours revealed the true scope of the conspiracy he had stumbled upon. Just before dawn, he watched as David McGrath and 2 other men he didn't recognize approached the mine from the residential area. They moved carefully, staying in the shadows and clearly avoiding the main paths. Each carried what appeared to be mining equipment, but their movements were too purposeful for routine maintenance work. Around 8 a.m., Thomas Caldwell emerged from the mine office and walked to the equipment shed. He remained there for nearly an hour, during which time Robert observed him making several trips between the shed and the mine entrance, carrying items that he couldn't identify from his position. The crucial moment came just before the morning shift change at 10 a.m. Marcus Webb arrived at the mine early and went directly to Caldwell. The 2 supervisors had an intense, whispered conversation before Webb headed into the Eastern Tunnel alone. 20 minutes later, an explosion rocked the mountainside. The blast came from deep within the Eastern Tunnel, exactly where Robert had been scheduled to conduct his inspection. Windows rattled throughout Lantern Ridge, and a cloud of dust and debris erupted from the mine entrance. Within minutes, the mine's emergency whistle was screaming across the valley, summoning rescue crews and medical assistance. Robert rushed toward the mine entrance, his heart pounding with the realization that he was supposed to have been in that tunnel when the explosion occurred. If he had followed his original schedule, if he hadn't postponed the inspection based on Caldwell's suspicious request, he would likely be dead. As rescue efforts began, Robert noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Among the family members gathering anxiously outside the mine, He spotted David McGrath and the other men he had seen approaching earlier. They stood with the crowd, expressing the same concern and fear as everyone else. But Robert now understood they weren't waiting to learn about casualties. They already knew exactly what had happened, because they had made it happen. Just when we think we've grasped the full scope of this conspiracy, the horror in Lantern Ridge intensifies. If this story is giving you the creeps, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Give it a like to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next in this web of revenge and justice. The explosion in the eastern tunnel had been carefully designed to look like an accidental gas ignition, but Robert's engineering knowledge allowed him to recognize signs that others missed. The blast pattern, the location of the debris, and the specific type of damage all pointed to deliberate sabotage using dynamite placed in precise locations. More importantly, Robert realized that he had been the intended target. His investigation into the mining accidents had not gone unnoticed. Someone had decided that the new engineer was getting too close to the truth and needed to be eliminated before he could expose the systematic murder of miners who threatened company interests. But the sabotage had been carried out by the families of the murdered miners, not by the company itself. This revelation forced Robert to confront a complex moral equation that had no simple solutions. Over the following days, as the mine remained closed for safety investigations, Robert pieced together the full scope of what had been happening in Lantern Ridge. The light signals had been coordinating a sophisticated network of family members seeking justice for their murdered loved ones. They had spent years gathering evidence, infiltrating company operations, and planning retribution against those responsible for the deaths. David McGrath and his allies had been working with someone inside the mine's management structure. Someone who had access to shift schedules, safety reports, and personnel files. That someone had been providing information about which company officials were directly involved in the murder conspiracy and when opportunities for retaliation would arise. The breakthrough came when Robert confronted Thomas Caldwell directly. Armed with his detailed observations and timeline of events, Robert cornered the supervisor in his office 3 days after the explosion. "I know about the light signals," Robert said without preamble. "I know about the coordination with the McGrath family. And I know that explosion was meant for me." Caldwell's immediate reaction was not denial but resignation. The older man's shoulders sagged as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from them. "How long have you known?" Caldwell asked quietly. "Long enough to understand that 7 miners didn't die in accidents," Robert replied. "What I don't understand is why you've been helping their families plan revenge instead of reporting the murders to authorities." Thomas Caldwell's story, revealed over the next hour, exposed the full horror of what had been happening at Blackstone Mine. Caldwell himself had been coerced into participating in the murder conspiracy after witnessing Marcus Webb deliberately trigger a tunnel collapse that killed Patrick O'Brien in 1885. "Webb caught me leaving the mine late one night after I'd been drinking," Caldwell explained, his voice heavy with shame and exhaustion. "He told me I'd seen O'Brien ignore safety protocols and cause his own death through carelessness. He said if I didn't support that story, I'd find myself in a similar accident very soon." But Caldwell had family connections to several of the murdered miners. When Michael McGrath, David's older brother, began organizing for better wages, Caldwell had tried to warn him about the danger. McGrath's response had been to ask Caldwell to secretly gather evidence about the company's murder operation. "Michael wanted to take everything to the state authorities," Caldwell continued. "He believed the law would protect honest working men against company violence. But before he could act, they killed him too and made it look like equipment failure." After McGrath's death, his younger brother David had approached Caldwell with a different philosophy. If the law wouldn't protect miners from company violence, then the families would have to protect themselves. They would gather evidence not for legal prosecution, but for targeted retaliation against those directly responsible for the murders. The light signals had been David McGrath's system for coordinating surveillance, planning, and execution of their revenge operation. Each sequence communicated specific information: which supervisors were on duty, when opportunities for sabotage would arise, and how to time their actions to maximize impact while minimizing risk to innocent workers. "The explosion that was meant for you," Caldwell said, looking directly at Robert, "was supposed to be the final phase. Webb convinced the company owners that you were becoming too much of a liability with your safety improvements and accident investigations. They decided you needed to be eliminated just like the others. But David and his people found out about the plan. They decided to turn the company's own murder weapon against them. The explosion was meant to kill Webb, not you. When Webb went into that tunnel alone, he thought he was checking on sabotage equipment that would kill you later. Instead, he triggered the trap they had set for him. Marcus Webb had survived the explosion, but with injuries severe enough to end his career and leave him permanently disabled. The official investigation concluded that he had accidentally triggered a gas explosion while conducting routine safety checks. Ironic justice for a man who had murdered miners by staging similar accidents. Robert faced an agonizing decision about what to do with his knowledge. He possessed evidence of both the company's murder conspiracy and the family's revenge operation. Legally, he should report everything to authorities. Morally, the situation was far more complex. The families had been seeking justice for genuine crimes that the legal system had either ignored or failed to recognize. Their methods had been extreme, but their cause was legitimate. The company officials responsible for the murders remained in positions of power, protected by wealth and political connections that made legal prosecution unlikely. After weeks of internal struggle, Robert chose a middle path that honored both justice and mercy. He compiled detailed evidence of the company's murder conspiracy and submitted it anonymously to state mining authorities and newspaper editors in Charleston and Pittsburgh. The documentation was thorough enough to trigger official investigations that would ultimately expose the systematic killing of miners and lead to criminal charges against surviving conspirators. At the same time, Robert approached David McGrath and the other family members involved in the revenge operation. He offered them a choice. They could disappear from Lantern Ridge before the official investigations reached conclusions that might implicate them, or they could stay and face potential prosecution for their own actions. Most of the families chose to leave, using money they had secretly accumulated over years of planning to relocate to other mining regions where they could start fresh. David McGrath was among the last to go, but not before expressing gratitude that someone in authority had finally acknowledged the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. Thomas Caldwell submitted his resignation from Blackstone Mining Company and provided sworn testimony to state investigators about the murder conspiracy. His cooperation helped ensure convictions against the surviving company officials, though Caldwell himself faced charges for his complicity in covering up the crimes. Robert remained at Lantern Ridge long enough to see significant changes implemented in mine safety and worker protection. The state investigations had exposed corruption that extended far beyond Blackstone Mine, leading to comprehensive reforms in mining industry regulation and oversight. The mysterious lights never appeared again on the mountainside above Lantern Ridge. The families who had operated the signal network were gone, their mission complete, and their loved ones finally avenged. The mountain returned to its natural darkness, broken only by the ordinary lights of a community trying to rebuild itself on a foundation of truth rather than lies. But on certain cold, clear nights, longtime residents of Lantern Ridge claimed they could still see brief flashes in the darkness. Not signals of conspiracy and revenge, but memories of ordinary people who had refused to let murder be disguised as accident, and who had found their own way to balance the scales of justice when the law failed them. This mystery shows us that sometimes the most complex conspiracies grow from the simplest human needs: the need for truth, the need for justice, and the need to protect those we love from those who would harm them. The flickering lights of Lantern Ridge were never supernatural phenomena. They were the visible signs of invisible bonds that connect families, communities, and conscience across time and distance. What do you think about this story? Do you believe the families were justified in seeking their own justice when the legal system failed them? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dark tale of industrial conspiracy and mountain justice, subscribe to our channel, activate the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates stories where ordinary people fight back against extraordinary corruption. Until next time, remember that some lights in the darkness are signals, and some signals carry messages that change everything.